Welcome to Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield. This episode is sponsored by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. Call us at 719-452-4803. Here's your host, Trever Shirin.
Thank you for joining us. We are thrilled to have Susan Payne with us. Susan Payne is the Executive Director of Safe Communities, Safe Schools, and Safe2Tell for the State of Colorado Attorney General's Office, and has been in law enforcement for 28 years and is currently an agent for the state of Colorado. And we're thrilled to have you here because Susan's become a friend of ours and is doing some incredible things in the state of Colorado and beyond. So Susan, would you mind just explaining to our listeners what Safe2Tell is, what its mission and goal is?
Sure, I'd love to. I would say it goes all the way back to learning lessons in hindsight of tragedies. And in being in law enforcement, the one thing you realize when you respond to a tragedy is you're going to learn what happened. You're going to find out what could have been prevented. And in hindsight, we know that most tragedies could have been prevented had the right people been informed of what was taking place, and there could have been an intervention. So really, Safe2Tell, the reason it's here is to provide a protected method of communication, to remove the code of silence, and to engage young people and other stakeholders in early recognition of concerning behavior or indicators that there's a problem so that we can prevent bad things from happening to children. That's really summarizing it. So a little more sophisticated would mean that in order to do that, we needed to have a platform of anonymity. So by law, we have an anonymous way for anyone to speak up, either by phone, a mobile app, or an online approach. And the goal is to really make sure that you connect pieces of the puzzle. So we're looking for an early intervention, an early recognition that someone needs help, and the ability to prevent a greater tragedy from occurring. And we do that through really a pretty sophisticated platform of layers of protection and accountability to make sure that when information comes through, it goes out to the right jurisdiction, to the local school and law enforcement agency, and that there's that accountability that someone responded and looked into it and is following up.
So if I past conversations that you and I have had, you've mentioned this came out of the Columbine tragedy. Is that correct? Is that when it kind of started, or is that kind of what catapulted it into existence more so?
Well, and actually it came out of the Pikes Peak community.
Okay.
So I was a detective with the Colorado Springs Police Department, and we had several tragedies here. And really, we implemented the pilot. I was able to start the pilot not only in El Paso County, but Teller County.
Okay.
And we incorporated education and engagement in all of the school districts. And we created an anonymous way to speak up if you saw concerning behavior or someone that needed help. And we were able to prevent over 200 tragedies. So actually, 2 weeks before the Columbine tragedy, I spoke to state officials. And I think 2 weeks later, the Columbine tragedy happened. And even after that, the state immediately started a tip line, and that tip line was implemented. And after an assessment 2 years later, it was deemed to be ineffective.
Okay.
And that's where we knew we had to bring forth the comprehensive model that we had created in the Colorado Springs community.
So offline, before we started, you had mentioned that there's a difference between a tip line and what Safe2Tell is. Help our listeners understand what the difference between just a plain old tip line is versus what Safe2Tell is and what you do with safe schools and safe communities.
So part of a tip line is really engaging young people. One, I think in an age-appropriate level, we have to teach young people how to keep themselves and others safe,
Right.
whether it's in school or out in the community.
Right.
And we want them to be aware of issues and be able to recognize concerns early, because the earlier that we can intervene, we can prevent so much more, and we can provide a system of support for someone that needs it. So really, young people are the front lines. We've learned that throughout history. And the difference is having an education and curriculum that talks about those issues with young people and engages them to be part of the solution, along with a very sophisticated platform, the mobile app or the Safe2Tell online method of reporting social norms today. Young people would rather text it to you than talk about it.
Sure.
It's a very comfortable method of communication. Also, having a law that makes it anonymous. And that's where young people really have to trust that if I'm going to speak up that someone needs help, I know that I'm not going to be retaliated against. It's not going to be misinterpreted. It's not going to be considered a betrayal. So often it's meant as a method of help.
Right.
And that's why it's used. So I think our ability to do all of those things and have the layers of protection that when it is emergent or imminent risk to life, we have the ability to get the right emergency responders going and the access through our watch center to get the right people there.
And Susan, I have a thought that I'm sure I've heard about Safe2Tell before, and I want to get it out of the way before we go too much further. But it's the thought of the opportunity that kids now have to bully each other through Safe2Tell or to misuse what Safe2Tell is trying to do. And I know that of all the people that I've talked to, that is the only complaint that I've ever heard. And I know that I've seen Safe2Tell work really well, but how would you explain how Safe2Tell goes about those situations where a kid is misusing this anonymous tool?
So one, we take that very serious. So if someone is using it to harass or use it as a method, and you can ascertain that it's being used for that purpose, that is a misuse of Safe2Tell, and we're going to work with local law enforcement and schools to try to determine what's taking place. But it also gives us the information that someone is a target, and how are we going to work together with the key resources to ascertain what's going on with that individual. So we have methods within the system to flag it, to communicate back, to block the person reporting it if we need to. But really with the local law enforcement and the school officials, we're usually able to work through those. So we strategically count those. They're less than 3%.
Wow.
And when it does happen, we have procedures in place to work through it. And in the next year, we're really going to do a more robust effort with that to work together to see what we can work through and if there needs to be an exception in the law, because we're certainly leading the way in this country.
Yeah.
Well, I find it interesting that those that we talk about that bring that piece up that you just said, for some reason they focus on that. And I'm like, if there's those bogus reports and yet we're still getting people, it's... I think we go look at the bigger picture, the benefit outweighs the cost.
Well, and what we do know is in the schools that we actually directly do engagement and education with students about, so we've done our research with pre and post survey questions with our academic, we have conversation jumpstarts, and we can see a 95% change in mindset of a willingness to speak up early, and that they recognize that it can prevent so much and provide a system of support. And that really staying silent can be the betrayal of everyone.
Right.
But in schools that we do that, we have less than a 1% misuse rate, and in some cases 0. So we know where we can do education and really engage students as to why this is made possible. They really use it in the right way.
Well, it's interesting. I'm doing research right now. I'm in the process of writing a book on suicide and self-injury and doing research on statistics and that kind of thing. And it's interesting to me that that more states are not using this more because the national standard the national statistics just came out that suicide nationwide is up 33%. And you think logically, at least I try to be logical most times, where you put this together going, is it going to be this continued rise in suicide, or are we going to is the nation going to take on this idea of Safe2Tell and we're going to, will it plateau and go down? But there's a systemic issue too, right? I mean, it's not just, and Safe2Tell is amazing because it gets people the help that they need, but also getting people the right caregivers for support.
Well, and here it is. In my work as a police officer, a detective, as a team leader for hostage and crisis negotiation, the bottom line is we've had in this country hotlines where young people or adults or anyone that is in crisis can call. They can talk to someone. Hopefully they can learn strategies of bringing themselves into a more healthy place. But there's a whole nother layer that's been missing, and that's the bystander, the people that recognize that someone is struggling or needs help. And the bottom line with young people today and the social norms, they communicate more with their peers than any teacher. They know how to hide it from the adults. And when their peers are seeing it, they need to be part of the solution. And that bystander approach is what we're focusing on. So it's an added layer. And the interesting part of the data and what we get is an insight into what young people are saying. And the number one thing they're reporting is friends that are suicidal. Number 2, kids that are using substances or drugs. Number 3, bullying. Number 4, friends that are depressed. Number 5, friends that are self-injuring. If you combined those that are reporting suicide, depression, or self-injury, we wouldn't even be able to put a graph together because it goes all the way off the chart.
Okay.
So when you look at those things, sometimes we focus on the umbrella language of suicide, but we really have to get down to educating young people about recognizing concerning behaviors and all of the things that play a part of that. So if there's someone that's sad, we don't have to say depressed, but untreated depression is really what equals suicide in my eyes. So if we can intervene with someone that is struggling with a breakup, struggling with some sort of trauma in their life, disappointment, failure, or loss, and connect the right adults and resources that communities have, to me, that's the win-win.
Absolutely.
And what we want is a system of support for that individual to continue and to verify within the system that that takes place so that nothing falls through the cracks.
I love it. I think it's interesting to me that more people haven't jumped on the bandwagon sooner. It has to take another crisis or tragedy for people to go, oh, maybe we should have something. Because I see a tip line or a hotline just kind of going, hello, how can I help you? And there's not any follow-up or that connection to the right resources and the immediacy.
Well, and part of it is sometimes people check the box. They want to do something really fast in the aftermath of a tragedy. It's heartbreaking for me as a mom to see the loss in Florida and to know that we could have prevented it and that there are infrastructures to prevent it and best practice standards of care. How do we do that across this country? Because the realistic picture is a tip in Florida could prevent a tragedy in Colorado. There are no longer jurisdictional boundaries. Young people are communicating their online gaming with people from other states, other countries. We have prevented school shootings and suicides in other countries, other states. And as a matter of fact, 4 days after the Parkland tragedy, we prevented another school shooting in Florida due to a tip in Colorado. So what we really need is an infrastructure across this country to make sure that we're getting this right.
And so I know for me, I get intimidated when we enter into a legislative or political realm because I feel like I have the opportunity to voice my thoughts and make something happen maybe once every couple of years when the polls open. And I know that there's more that we can do on the political front, but for the teenager who may be listening or the mom, what kind of things can we begin to do today that can change that culture, that can build a culture that is going to be more productive towards prevention than we have right now?
So I guess number one off the top of my head would be have the conversation. We have to have the conversation about what are the issues young people are facing, and we have to believe it can happen here. I think so often I've been trying to sell my whole career that, Columbine, Littleton, Colorado, could it happen here? Well, it did, and it can happen anywhere. But also kids that are struggling with depression or sadness, trauma, disappointment, failure, loss is likely to happen to your child. So you have to recognize it can happen here, and you have to be informed. You have to have the conversation, but you also need to make sure that young people don't feel like they have to suffer in silence. And that goes for the people. We have to change the culture. That's the number one thing. We have to shift the culture through the conversation. And we now need to engage people to know immediately how to recognize a cry for help and how to connect the dots so that you can get that person help and to remove any of the social barriers that are in the way. So I think that's one of the things that we've tried to do. And I think it's really worked. The lives that have been saved are tremendous. 2,600 suicidal children responded to last year alone. That's an incredible number.
It's amazing.
And the heroes out there we'll never know.
Right.
Are the ones that took a stand and spoke
Right.
up, and reading their plea to get a friend help is some of the most amazing moments in my career.
Well, it's just interesting. I'm glad that you say talk about it, because I think a lot of parents that we've worked with don't want to have those conversations with their kids because that mindset is not going to happen in my house. And I always come back with saying, well, then let's make sure that it doesn't happen in your house. Have the conversation.
Have
right?
the conversation and focus on the behaviors. Sometimes what parents have a block in is talking about suicide, that big word. But if you talk about things that you know would be likely, the
Right.
smaller words or the behaviors or the concerns of what's a healthy way to cope with the pressures you're feeling?
Right.
What's a healthy way to manage social stress? What are some of the things you're struggling with as a young person with a developing brain? I think putting yourself in their shoes and taking the time to listen is one of the greatest things a parent can do.
Absolutely. I second, third, fourth, and fifth that one, because it's amazing to me how scared parents can get with, I don't want to dive into that because my kid doesn't struggle with that. I don't want to talk about that because, and I think a lot of it is more fear-based from the parent standpoint. And so getting parents educated and helping parents with those conversations is a big deal. But it sounds like you're saying the same thing. Sometimes just dive into the conversation and kind of make sense of it as you're wading through, because your kid's going to educate you on a lot of things too if you really have that relationship built up. When you take the risk as a parent to have that conversation and the kid then comes back, well, no, it's not this, but it's more like this. Now you've got an open door to have more of those conversations with your kids.
And role play. I
Yes.
like the idea. My dad was a SWAT commander here and worked as a police officer his whole life. And Bill Thede, I'd like to shout out because it was just Father's Day. But I think it's important to role play with your kids. What would you do if? And how would you feel if?
Yeah.
And also don't minimize it, because all of us can remember heartbreak.
Right.
But as time goes by, it gets better and it lessens. So when we put ourselves in their shoes and we add social media to the mix, I think that is a tremendous burden in lives of children that we really don't know how to equate it. I think we can try to understand, but what we really do is have to open up that conversation about how impactful it is, and how when they're really struggling with something and they tend to dive into social media, it looks like everybody else's lives are perfect.
Right.
And I think it just compounds the problem.
Right.
And it's important to just recognize that those issues and their pressures and the pressure they put on themselves and the outside pressures, we have to do an assessment, and we have to continually do it as parents, and we can't do it if we're not talking about it.
And can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by role playing with our
Sure.
kids?
Well, here's the thing, is training law enforcement, or for me, even in police work, one of the best ways we learn is through scenario-based training. So for young people in my career, I've had the opportunity to teach in elementary schools, DARE officer, high schools, do a lot of crisis response work. And when you can go through with young people and teach them some even social skills, you can better prepare them for the future. So an age-appropriate thing, even for a 4 or 5-year-old with Kid Power, Jan Isaacs Henry in town. I'm a big fan. I served on the board for 10 years. Teaching them ways of understanding when you get to a safe adult, and role-playing what you do when you get there, and what might be a scenario of someone trying to probe the boundaries of any age, no matter what your child's age is. And asking them, what would you do if someone right now offered you a beer? It makes them think about what's their response going to be, and to talk about it.
Well, we do that with I have 2 girls, and we do that with them a lot of not so much like substance stuff, but what if a guy comes up to you or a girl comes up to you in the bathroom and says, "Hey, come with me," or different scenarios of kind of predatory behavior, and we don't point it out as that because I don't want to scare them, but it's more of that, what would you do in these scenarios, and get some really good answers in that dialogue.
And you want to be
continues.
able for them to establish for any of those things their own personal boundaries
Yes.
and ways to communicate what they're not willing to do. And even adults struggle.
Yes.
For example, adults will say, well, I don't know. I was at the Las Vegas shooting, for example. And, sheltered in place. I laid on the floor, and then I kept, they didn't know if they should run or they should stay, and they second guessed when they did run that they bypass victims. These are the kind of things that when we work with children or any adult, if we can better do scenarios or drills or practice these kind of things, they can be better prepared to handle them in a way that they feel very confident about. And that's what helps them feel more self-assured.
Right.
And it also helps in the recovery. They did all that they could.
And I think it's what I'm hearing too is we're in a world nowadays where it's less of a far off if something could happen and more of it's going to happen. We're going to have an interaction with a friend who is self-harming or suicidal or depressed or God forbid we'll be in a situation where there's an active shooter. That's just kind of where we're at, or we're going to be affected by it somehow. And so a lot of the fear that I know parents have is I don't want to introduce my child to something and have that be like expose them to the darkness of this world when they're never going to interact with it anyways. And I think that's built on a fallacy that we can protect our kids from what now could be considered a normal human experience.
Well, I mean, one thing I see with that a lot of is just really helping parents going, what are age appropriate things you can introduce to your kids?
Right.
So from a 4 or 5 year old, you might not talk about mass shooting or suicide,
No.
right? You're going to talk about what if somebody approaches you in the school parking lot and offers you to come with them because they've got candy in their car.
Right.
Like, what do you do? And if they say, well, I'm gonna go get the candy, like now you've got a conversation.
Right.
But it's just that then you ratchet it up at 7 years old. It's like our podcast when we talk about how do we talk to our kids about sex and healthy sexual behavior. It's the age appropriate conversation that starts young and works your way up to when they leave.
And here's what I would say, with all of these things and all of these things, we could have probably a different conversation about sexual violence in children. 93% of the time you're looking at someone that has gained and earned their trust. So we have to be really strategic, and we have to be well informed as to the true research and the facts as parents, but how well informed and how well equipped are our children? So the difference between success and failure is being prepared and teaching children how to do drills. We're doing that in schools. Teaching them when they fly in a plane, what happens if the oxygen mask. We don't change that depending on the age, but I think we can do it in a healthy way at age appropriate levels and make sure that I want them to be able to recognize the world around them and to look around and to have that situational awareness. I'm sorry, I'm more law enforcement terminology.
No, it's good.
But I want them to have that situational awareness and realize they have strength in numbers. How do they build on their resources and strengths? Staying with friends that have pro-social relationships, having positive, caring, committed adults in their lives. What parents need to realize is our children, no matter what we do, will face trauma. They will have disappointment, failure, loss, and I know I've said that a couple times. So how do we best prepare them with life skills and resiliency so that when it does happen, they right away have a healthy framework of how to cope?
Well, and what I'm hearing too is for the kid who goes through all of high school and doesn't experience a major traumatic event, but they've been trained, they've gone through scenarios, the drills, and they've had training and education around what if. There's an empowerment that comes from that of being strong enough in yourself and confident in if something were to happen, I know what to do. And I hope that it never happens, but I know what I would do. And I've drilled this, and I have an understanding, and I know where safe people are, and I know where my boundaries are. I think that is such a powerful tool that maybe we don't focus so much on, what we're training against or doing drills for, but just that empowerment piece is a goal worthy of itself. And then you also have the ability to prevent and to recover from certain things that happen as well. So I think there's so much to what you're saying.
Well, and that's
for
so
everybody.
well said. I mean, what you just said is, critical, because there's a healing property to being part of the solution, but there's a preventative focus and to being part of the solution early on. And it still comes back when someone, despite all those things, is exhibiting signs of struggling or hurting or concerning and someone actually recognizes it and speaks up, and we connect them with a caring, committed adult,
Right.
that we know by research is the number one protective factor, is a caring, committed adult that connects with a student that needs help. So that's what we try to do, and it really takes all of us, and I think we're making strides in that area. We need to be more robust and deliberate about engaging and having the conversation with our children, and also teaching them life skills. And we're looking at, do we incorporate that in the education system, knowing that that's a gap. Our children are not being raised with as much grit. And we see it especially in middle class communities, where we see it in kids that are struggling every day in maybe higher crime rate communities or lower socioeconomics. We are not seeing the same level of maybe completed suicides. So we really want to talk about young people feeling very well equipped and really well prepared, and understanding healthy ways of coping with pressures and the stressors that might come into their lives.
Well, I love the term grit. I mean, grit and resiliency in my mind go together. And how do we help kids work through those tough things of failure and loss and disappointment, and develop that coping mechanism that's going to take them through the rest of their life, prepare them well. My question for you as we kind of wrap up is if we have listeners that are listening from all over the country here, and if they want to get more involved, or if they want to be an advocate for legislation that can bring Safe2Tell to their area, what kind of things would you suggest that they do, and maybe who should they reach out to be able to get this amazing tool that we're so blessed to have in Colorado in their state?
So I would encourage them to get on the Safe2Tell website at safe2tell.org. Safe2tell.org, and that's the number 2 in there. And that was just a branding we created to make sure that young people would remember it, and they do. But that framework is very sophisticated, and I'm briefing 21 states next week in Oregon at a summit, and I'm seeing more interest. I'm working with the Secret Service at the national level. I do think it's time for people to make sure they're writing their legislators. Legislators are looking for effective legislation that they can pass that will really be meaningful. And what this is a measurable outcome. We can show the effectiveness. Nevada, for example, implemented January 5th, and in the first 2 months, they had over 1,500 reports.
Wow.
And the number one thing that was intervened in Nevada, youth suicide. So we're seeing something around this country that we have a lot of children that are suffering in silence and are hurting. And when we can connect them with a system of support, I think that's a huge success.
I love it. Well, Susan, thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to hang out with us today. We appreciate your friendship and what you're doing in this state, in this country, and we just really, really appreciate you being here today.
Well, and I thank you, because we can't do it without partnership and collaboration. That's what's gotten us to this moment in time, and we have to continue to grow on those things. And for me, what I see moving forward is that when we have a young person identified and we know they've been connected to resources, the mother in me wants to know that that child is still doing well a year from now, 2 years from now, and has that system of support. So thank you for what you do.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, go to mayfieldcounseling.com/Candid Conversations and check out our Facebook page, Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield.